Hello everybody, I am Emmanuel Douzery from the University of Montpellier, and I am going to give a talk entitled History, Processes and Patterns in Biological Evolution. During this talk I am going to try to answer a question, an important question in biology: why is there such a huge diversity of organisms on Earth? For example, in this slide, you can see that there are millions of species on Earth, and these species are very different, the one from the other. For example, you can find bacteria, archaea, you can find eukaryote, organisms with cells with a nucleus, and in eukaryote you have flowering plants, fungi, animals. And on the slide, on the bottom right, you can see a dinosaur, just to remind you that most of the species are now extinct on Earth. In other words, living species represent less than 1% of all the species that existed one day on Earth. So we have a tremendous biodiversity of organisms on Earth, and the question is, why such a huge biodiversity? My talk will be divided into three chapters. The first is a quite long preamble discussing about the unicity and the diversity of organisms. And first of all, in biology, we should study these organisms, and for this we examine what we call characters. And these characters appear to be witnesses of the history of the organisms. And the study of this character will show us that organisms are unique but also diverse on Earth. So all the characters we can use rely on the level of observation of the biologist. For example, you can have a look on the external or internal organization of the organism. This is their morphology or anatomy. You can have a look on the sequence of development of organisms from the egg or zygote to the adult. You can have a look on the cytology or karyology. This is the structure of the cell or the structure of the nucleus for eukaryotes. But today we rely heavily upon the molecules, in other words, DNA, RNA, and proteins. And better, we rely on the complete DNA of an organism. This is its genome, or the complete RNA or protein. This is the transcriptome or the proteome. In other words, what we call molecular characters is all the information you can collect from the study of one given DNA, RNA, or protein sequence compared in a lot of different organisms. As shown on the slide, you can see what we call sequence alignment. This is the same molecule compared in different organisms. And as you can see with the colors of the nucleotide or of the amino acids, you have positions in the molecule which are conserved, and you have positions which are variable. We have witnesses of the history of the organisms. These witnesses are the characters. And this character shows that organisms, all organisms on Earth are quite similar. For example, all are made of cells, with or without nucleus. All of them are genetic material with DNA or RNA. So you have a lot of shared characteristics. But also you have a lot of differences, I have shown you before, with very different organisms. For example, from the bat to the fungi or to the bacteria. So the second point in this preamble will be how biologists conceived this diversity of organisms and how they explain it through time. So the first hypothesis a long time ago, centuries ago, was a fixist conception, which means that people thought that organisms were once created by a given entity, for example, a divinity, and this organism didn't change through time. So, as you can see on the slide, this means that we started with very different organisms. Time elapsed for a million or billion of years, and today we have this always this diversity of organisms. So, if I tell you that, of course, it means that this fixed conception has nearly no explanatory power, because the present-day diversity of organisms is just explained by a diversity which has been created centuries ago. So we didn't explain anything. So we should wait for the 18th century and with people, the work of people like Linné, for example, which proposed a different conception of the diversity of organisms. And this conception was the fact that there is a natural ladder of life from which we move from mineral matter, for example, rocks. And then, gradually, we increase in complexity with organisms more and more complex. For example, simple cells first, then the plants and the fungi, which will be intermediate organisms, which will be higher than inferior organisms on this ladder of life. And then higher organisms, the animals. For example, always in my example, the earthworm, the bat, or the dinosaur, and with the striking characteristic that man is on the top. As you can see, man is on the top of this ladder of life. In this conception, you have a connection between all these organisms, and we move from simple to more complex organisms. So this ladder of life involves that you have a gradual hierarchy of complexity in the organisms on Earth. And as time elapses, we have more and more complexification. So the new organisms which appear are more complex than the previous ones. However, this is quite a misconception somewhere, because we know today that we are not moving from one existing organism, for example, one plant, to an animal along this ladder of life. We should wait from the works of Darwin and Wallace, nearly in the middle of the 19th century. And Darwin, Wallace and colleagues propose that the better or the best description of the diversity of organisms on Earth is explained by a phylogenetic conception. A phylogenetic conception, it means that the phylogeny, it is the history of the descent of organisms through time, but with modification from common ancestors. So the basic idea, as you can see on the slide, is we start from a common ancestor, which is at the root of my tree. And then, as time elapses, we move from simple and more complex organisms. But contrary to the ladder of life, you see that these organisms are not themselves connected. They are connected through their common ancestors. However, the first phylogeny which has been depicted kept this very strong idea of ladder of life. So, in the first phylogenetic trees, we find inferior organisms, intermediate organisms, superior organisms, and always man is, as you can see, on the top. Nowadays, the modern phylogenetic conception is nearly the same, but all the organisms are on the same level in the phylogeny. So in this slide, you see that the bacteria, the archaea, the flowering plants, the dinosaurs, the fungi, and so on, are all on the same level on this phylogenetic tree. So this modern phylogenetic conception has two great advantages in order to explain the unicity and the diversity of the organism on Earth. First of all, the unicity is explained because all the organisms share a common ancestor. So if you share a common ancestor, it means that you have a legacy from this common ancestor. So it explains the fact that organisms share some the same characteristics. But as you can see on the slide, along the orange branches, you have a descent with modification from these common ancestors. So this descent with modification is the evolution, is a biological evolution of the organisms. And it means that from one common ancestor to another, you have gradual change through time. And this explains why you have so many different organisms on Earth in the past and today. So, to conclude with this point, the last universal common ancestor is called LUCA. You see it is at the root of this giant tree of life. And from this universal common ancestor, there are successive divergences, which, after biological evolution, lead to the diversity of organisms encountered on Earth. So, with this phylogenetic conception, we have a very strong explanatory power, which resolves the paradox of organisms being unique but also diverse. So, I spoke about the characters in order to study organisms. I spoke about different conceptions explaining this diversity of organisms, and the modern conception is the phylogenetic conception. And the last part of this long preamble will be the fact that we should now try to explain why there is this phylogeny or this history of the descent of organisms. And for this, I will need to speak about what is called gene trees and the species trees. To understand why evolution on Earth can be conceived as this giant phylogenetic tree, as I showed you previously, just remind that from generation to generation of organisms, we move from the generation of the grandparents, which gave rise to the parents, to the children, to the grandchildren, and so on. On the slide, each rectangle symbolizes an individual, and two white circles depict the genetic toolkit, which is inherited from our parents. So we have two genetic toolkits, one from our father and one from our mother, and it's the same situation for all organisms which reproduce with two sexes. We have these different generations. And now have a look on a piece of the genetic information in one grandparent, for example, a grandparent C1. And C1 reproduce and give individual C2 and then D3. So it means that this DNA copy is transmitted generation from generation through reproduction. But as you can see, at the third generation, this blue DNA copy became extinct. So it means that a lot of DNA copies are lost during the evolution of organisms. But now have a look on another copy of DNA, the orange copy. This copy of DNA for organisms for which DNA is a genetic material, or virus for which sometimes this is RNA as a genetic material. So DNA or RNA copy can be transmitted to one or several offsprings. And as you can see, in these 4 generations, the initial orange copy is transmitted into 4 identical copies in the grandchildren generation. Now, forget the organisms and just focus on the transmission of the genetic information. As you can see, the orange copy is transmitted from generation and will exist in 4 copies in a few generations. This means that if a DNA copy is transmitted to a minimum of 2 descendants, It means that you generate a tree-like structure in the transmission of the genetic information. You have a tree-like structure, and sometimes, as you can see for the second node of my tree-like structure, you have even transmission of 3 different copies. In other words, it exists a phylogeny of genes. The genetical information is transmitted from generation to generation, and when this transmission involves at least 2 offsprings, you begin to have this tree-like structure diverging through time. So this is what we call the gene tree. It means that there is a genealogy of genes in organisms through time. Now, have a look if we use a kind of backward zoom, and now we consider, for example, 10 generations. You will have a lot of different DNA copies which will be either extinct or transmitted from offspring to next generation. And if the divergence between the genetic information is important, sometimes the individuals cannot reproduce the one with the others. This means that you have separation of the initial species into 2 descending species. So here you begin to understand how new species appear from ancestral species. Moreover, if you have a look on a given trajectory of the gene tree, one additional phenomenon can occur. As I told you before, the genetic material is replicated and transmitted from generation to generation. But sometimes the enzymes replicating the DNA are prone to errors, and these errors are the mutations. So mutations superimpose with this gene tree history. And on my slide, you can see, for example, that we move from an orange ancestral copy to a pink one due to a mutation from A to G at the second position of an hypothetical ancestral sequence, which will be 5A, 5 adenines. So on position 2, we move from the orange to the pink copy because of a mutation of A to G. And during the same time, in the other part of the tree, we move from the orange to the blue copy because of a mutation from A to a C on a different position of the sequence. For example, the last position, and at position number 5, the A becomes the C during evolution. So here you understand how the genetic material is transmitted in a tree-like structure through time and become to diverge from the ancestral copy because of these mutations. Now we continue with the backward zoom. So more and more time elapsed. So you have this kind of picture. Here we are at the scale of dozens or hundreds of generations, which is huge for me and for you, of course, but at the geological scale, hundreds of bacterial or human generation, it's nearly nothing, and we are just in the field of the microevolution. Microevolution is evolution which occurs in a few generations. Now we continue with the backward zoom, and we are moving to time durations, which counts into millions of years or even billion of years. So in this case, you will see that you have the speciation. The ancestral species X gives birth to species Y or Z. And if we go back to the whole history of the organisms on Earth, you have this orange tree, which is a piece of the tree of life. The tree of life is the tree which is connecting all the species, extant or present day, that occurs on Earth. And this large-scale picture is called macroevolutionary picture because now we are counting into a million or a billion of generations or of years if we consider either the biological time, the generation, or the geological time, the million of years. So this preamble, as promised, was quite long. I needed to explain things about characters, phylogeny, and gene trees in species trees before moving to the two next parts of the talk. So the next part of the talk will address which are the processes undergoing, which organisms undergo during evolution. So by which processes the microevolution occurs. And the last chapter will be by which pattern the macroevolution with longer times occurs. And in the last part, I will address more the phylogenetic inference part. Keep the things on the few, what occurs in a few generations. So we are at the microevolution scale. And this macroevolution scale is studied by a field in biology which is called population genetics. So I am going to present you some of the results of the population genetics studies. And first of all, we are going to understand the fact that mutations are very important to explain the evolution of the organisms. So if you take a natural population is a collection of individuals living in a given ecosystem. For example, you can take human people. And if you sequence one part of the genetic toolkit of the organism, for example, one part of the mitochondrial DNA in 20 humans, you will have this kind of picture. You will find that nobody has exactly the same sequence in a given genomic region. So in my slide, you have 20 individuals align the same portion of the genome in these 20 individuals. And with the color of the nucleotides, you can see that nobody has exactly the same genetic toolkit. The only explanation we have for this is the fact that mutations accumulate through time, meaning that all people in a given natural population do have different sequences. The natural variability in the population in terms of characters, either morphological or molecular character, is called a polymorphism. So polymorphism is a very important characteristic of natural populations because thanks to polymorphism we can explain how variability will propagate through time and explain the huge diversity of organisms on Earth. If I take a schematic view of a population, we might observe something like this. In my ellipsis, you have a very small natural population. Again, the two circles symbolize genetic toolkit inherited from both parents. The rectangle is just to summarize an individual. Individuals which are called diploid do have two copies of the genetic material, as I told you, one from the father and one from the mother. Here we have 15 individuals, each with two different toolkits. Now, if we take a look at the genetic level, we can see, as I showed you on the previous slide, we can see that these organisms are different from the one from the other. For example, you have three versions of the copies because of mutations. You have the yellow, the red, and the blue copies in the populations. So, in one individual, you can have the same copy of the sequence. For example, you can see two yellow copies in one individual. But for some other individuals, you can have one red and one blue, or one yellow and one blue copy. It means that you have different combinations of genetic informations, and this is called a genotype. So a genotype is a genetic combination of the copy inherited from your father and the copy inherited from your mother. If we reason at the scale of the population, forget the individuals and just focus on the genetic toolkit. So if I remove the rectangles of the organisms, you have the genetic toolkit of the whole population. And you can see that here we have a collection of twice 15 individuals. It means we have 30 versions of the genes. And these gene or DNA copy are exactly at the same, in the same proportion. We have 1/3 of yellow, 1/3 of blue, and 1/3 of the red copy in the population. So you can see that we have polymorphism in the population. We have 3 different genetic toolkits with summarized with 3 colors. And these genetic toolkits are at the same frequency in the population. An important thing is the fact that if a mutation occurs in one individual, it cannot explain what is going to occur through time, because this individual does not necessarily reproduce at the next generation, as I showed you before. So what is important is not to reason with one individual, but with a collection of all the individuals of the population. This is the reason why we are speaking about population genetics and not genetics at the scale of one individual. So in biological evolution, what is important is what occurs at the scale of the population. Now, if we have a look on the fate of each of the mutations, what we can see is the fact that if one mutation occurs in individuals of your population, if this mutation is deleterious, I mean if it is detrimental for the life of the individual, the frequency of this mutation will increase when the mutation appears, but very quickly it will decrease because of the deleterious situation of this mutation. But sometimes, of course, this means that if the ancestral population is made of the white DNA copy, the new copy, the new mutation, will not propagate in the population. But now, if time elapses and you have a new mutation occurring, for example, a blue mutation, if this mutation is favorable, it means that it gave an advantage to the individuals having this mutation. The frequency of the mutation will rise very quickly in the population, because if it provides you with an advantage, of course, at each generation, on a very short period of time, the frequency of this mutation will increase. And we say that this mutation becomes the substitutions. It means that it invades all population. So you can see that now this favorable mutation is found in all organisms. This is all the blue points of my slide. And now the same phenomenon occurs. In this new collection of DNA copies, you have again the possibility to observe deleterious mutations, which will not invade the population. And a long time ago, you can find a new favorable mutation, for example, the pink one, which will replace the previous mutation. So here you understand that if the mutation is either deleterious or favorable, it means that these two mutations will have completely different fates during evolution. And favorable mutations have their frequency, which increase very quickly, because it confers advantages to the individuals having this new mutation. For example, in natural population, when there is an individual resistant to, for example, an antibiotics in bacteria, the frequency of the corresponding mutation is rising very, very quickly. So with the first part, we have an explanation for the polymorphism in population. This is the mutations. And now we are going to see that an important process occurring in biological evolution is natural selection. Natural selection, I think that you have all heard about this. It's an idea first proposed by Darwin and Wallace by the middle of the 29th century. And with this natural selection, we have here a deterministic process which will explain how frequencies of DNA mutation can change through time. To better understand what is natural selection, we should have a new concept, which is a concept of fitness, which will help you to understand what is natural selection. The fitness is often denoted with omega letter. The fitness is attached to a genotype, in other words, a combination of genetic information. And it's calculated by scoring the number of genotypes at the next generation divided by the number of genotypes at the previous generation. In other words, if the number of genotypes doesn't change through time, it means that the fitness will be equal to 1. In other words, the number of genotypes will be the same at the next at the previous generation. However, as I showed you before, some mutation can be deleterious and some mutation can be advantageous. So it means, in this case, that the number of genotypes bearing the corresponding mutation can change from one generation to another. So it means that we can move from the value of 1, and we can move by a coefficient called S, like selection. So if you have 1 plus S, it means that the number of genotypes increases at the next generation. And if you have 1 minus S, S is always positive, it means that the number of new genotypes will decrease. So the coefficient of selection S will measure the intensity with which a mutation will be either favorable or will be deleterious. In a given environment, this fitness actually combines two things. When you have an adult organism which will be able to reproduce, it means that the reproduction will involve producing gametes, and these gametes will fuse into a zygote. And this is one important aspect, which is the fecundity of the organisms. And for example, in animals or in plants, we know that some organisms have a very high fecundity. It is called R strategy. Whereas other individuals, like for example mammals, have a few, very few number of offspring. This is the K strategy, in which you have parental care and a low number of descendants. Either the R or the K strategy, in every case, you have a certain amount of fecundity, which means that a given adult gave rise to a given number of zygotes. But then, with the zygote, you have a survival phase, which is the second phase, in which the zygote will be able to grow, to develop, to grow, and on its turn to be an adult able to reproduce. So, as you can see, to move from the previous n generation to the n plus 1 next generation, you have a fecundity and a survival phases. So it means that the fitness is impacted by the fecundity of the organisms and by their ability to survive in a given environment. So to summarize, with this fitness concept, when the coefficient the S coefficient selection is positive, it means that genotypes have higher fitness, so they are going to be more frequent at the next generation. To the contrary, if S is negative, it means that genotypes have a lower fitness and they are becoming less frequent at the next generation. So with the fitness concept, we can now understand what is natural selection. The famous case study to illustrate what is natural selection is the case of a moth. The pepper moth, Biston betullaria, is a moth that has been studied heavily in England. Actually, this moth presents two different morphotypes. You have a white or whitish individual or black or blackish individuals. And these two kind of moths are differentially predated by birds. For example, these moths, when they are on a bark, for example, whitish bark, black individuals will be easily predated by birds because they are easily seen by the birds. To the contrary, there is a kind of camouflage for the white individuals because they are nearly invisible on the bark. So it means that if you start with a population with a mix of black and white individuals, and you wait several generations, first, second, and third generation, you have a differential survival due to bird predation between the white individuals and the black individuals. Actually, you will have more blackish individuals which will be predated by the birds. So the frequency of the black individuals, and therefore the frequency of their genetic toolkit will decrease through the generations, and by compensatory effect, the number of white individuals will increase in the population. So this is the natural selection, the fact that the number of descendants at each generation can fluctuate, and this is linked here with the different morphology of the two kind of moth, the black and the white, and this is due to an environmental pressure, which is here the bird predation. Now imagine that the color of the bark change, for example, because atmospheric pollution due to coal dust. This is what occurs during the Industrial Revolution in England. With more blackish bark, the phenomenon is inverted. And as you can see, you will have an advantage for the darker individuals, and the whitish individuals will be more easily predated by the birds. So if the environment changes, it means that the direction of the natural selection can change. In the previous case, with the white barks, white moths were favored. But with dark barks, this is a black moth, which will be rapidly favored in a few generations. As you can see, you will have differential predation with these individuals, and the frequency of the white moths will gradually decrease generation from generation. So if I try to recapitulate what is the important characteristic of the natural selection, if I recapitulate this, I should recapitulate the conditions under which natural selection will favor individuals who are producing more offspring as compared to other individuals. There are three conditions for which natural selection is going to act. The first condition is quite obvious. You should have variations or polymorphism in the natural population. Of course, if all individuals are strictly identical, you cannot have differences between these individuals. So here you understand how the mutation is important to generate polymorphic population. But now the second condition is the fact that you should have for some individuals a selective advantage which will grant adaptation to a given environment. For example, whitish moss will be advantageous when the bark of the tree is white. On the contrary will occur if the bark of the tree become darkened. So you should have a differential fitness of the individuals in the population and if one individual or a collection of individuals do have a greater fitness than the other, they will have a selective advantage. And the last and very interesting point is the fact that we need a third condition. If we would like that this phenomenon propagates through time, through millions or even billions of generations or million or billion of years, you should have a kind of memory of the phenomenon. The memory of the phenomenon is what we call the heredity. Heredity is the fact that the genetic toolkit is transmitted from generation to generation, and with this genetic toolkit, you have the information of the advantageous characters. So heredity warrants the fact that natural selection will occur from generation to generation. It's a kind of a memory, and this memory allows the transmission of the mutations from generation to the other. So to recapitulate a few important ideas in population genetics, first of all, you have the mutation. Then you have the natural selection, which is a deterministic process. I mean that if S is positive or negative, natural selection will act in one direction or the other, increasing or decreasing the amount of the genotypes. But what is very important in biological evolution is the fact that we have a stochastic component, a stochastic process, which is also very important. And this stochastic process is called the genetic drift. To understand this, keep in mind that when you start with the initial population in which the three variants were the red, the blue, and the yellow variants were at the same probability, remind that reproducing at the next generation involves that not all individuals are going to reproduce. So this means, very simply, that the genetic structure of the population will be slightly different from generation to the other generation, simply because each generation is an imperfect sample of the individual present at the previous generation. If all individuals would reproduce and transmitting exactly one DNA copy, we can assume a strictly identical population in terms of genetic structure. But this is not the case. You have sampling variance. This is a statistical characteristic, meaning that each sample is an imperfect sampling of what occurred at the previous generation. So it means that just because of statistical variation through time, due to the fact that not all individuals reproduce, you have fluctuation of the frequency of your yellow, red, and blue alleles or DNA copy through time. So as you can see on my slide, when time elapsed, these frequencies vary slightly. But what is important for the genetic drift is the fact that the genetic drift is impacted by, or its effect, sorry, the effect or the impact of the genetic drift is dependent upon the population, the size of the population under focus. There is no magic behind this. It's just, again, a statistical thing. You know that the sampling variance in statistics depends on the size of the sample. The larger the sample, the smaller the variance. But to the contrary, the smaller the samples, the higher the variance. So this is summarized on my 3 graphs. From top to bottom, you have a simulation of the fluctuation of the genetic frequencies of the DNA copies through time in a population with 2,000 individuals, on the middle 200, and at the bottom only 20 individuals. And as you can see, the smaller the size of the population, the more important the fluctuation of the alleles. And this is very easy to understand. With a very small population, if not all individuals reproduce, you can have one allele which is present at high frequency at the next generation, whereas other alleles are lost. So this means that the number of individuals which effectively reproduce at the next generation is a very important component of the evolution of natural population. And this parameter is called the effective population size, which can be approximated as the number of individuals really transmitting their genetic toolkit at the next generation. So if I take a schematic view of this means that if we start with a population with a high genetic diversity, you came back here to the blue, red, and yellow alleles. Sometimes you can have what we call the bottleneck. It means that very few individuals reproduce, for example, because of just by chance or because of a change in environment. And you can see in the middle that you have completely lost the blue alleles and you just keep the red and a few yellow copies. And after that, if more individuals reproduce, the number of the yellow and red alleles will increase again, but the bottleneck involves the complete loss of one of the allele. So this means that the effect of the genetic drift is more important in the small populations. So again, it's the sampling phenomenon, which means that in a small population reproducing at the next generation, you can easily have disappearance of one genetic toolkit, even if it bears very favorable mutations. Just by chance, you can lose favorable mutations and have an increase of deleterious mutations, just by chance. And this is observed in some cases, which are called the founder effect situations, in which you have migrants which move from an area to another one, for example, an island, and the migrating individuals just represent a small fraction of the diversity, the initial diversity, and this means that you will have a biased representation of the initial genetic diversity. This phenomenon occurs on islands, for example. We have the famous case of the flightless cormorant for the Galapagos, which is a bird which colonize these islands, which undergo a founder effect. And now, after many generations, you have birds which are nearly flightless. Of course, they always have wings, but which are not functional. So this means that thanks to a genetic drift, you can have a fixation of deleterious mutations or slightly deleterious mutations, and you can have a loss of favorable mutations. Of course, the contrary is possible, but here you can see that you have a very strong stochastic effect. So to summarize, the fate of the mutation will be governed by the S coefficient. If the mutations are what we call neutral, it means it's neither deleterious, neither advantageous. Everything can occur by stochastically, the frequency of the mutation can vary. Mutation can have the frequency increasing in the population, or the mutation can disappear. By the contrary, as I showed you before, deleterious and favorable mutation will have their frequency, which will decrease in case of counter-selected mutation, or their frequency will increase in case of positive selection. To summarize, the three factors which will impact the fate of the mutation in natural population are the rate at which a mutation appears. This is called a mutation rate. It will be governed by the S, the selective coefficient, either null, negative, or positive. And as I showed you before with the genetic drift, the efficient size of the population, often written NE, will also have a strong effect on the fate of mutations under selection. So now I have finished with the evolutionary processes at the scale of the population genetics. Now we are moving to the macro evolutionary scale, and we are going to discuss about evolutionary patterns which occurs for a great number of generations. So this means that we are moving in the field of the phylogenetic trees, and I will show you how we can reconstruct what occurs through time in terms of phylogeny. First of all, how can we reconstruct the history of the divergences of organisms? So how can we infer phylogenies just from the observation of the witnesses of the evolution? And I will recall you that the witnesses of evolution are the characters, either morphological or, for example, molecular characters. So to explain this, I have an example. The basic idea is to make a kind of vote approach, not with individuals which are going to vote for one people, but with a kind of a collection of characters which are going to vote for phylogenetic relatedness between organisms. My examples, I have 4 groups of organisms, what we call the lysamphibians, for example, the frogs and the toads. We have the crocodiles, the birds, and the mammals. And lysamphibians here will act as a reference, and my phylogenetic question will be, are crocodiles more closely related to birds or to mammals? Or the third solution, are birds more closely related to mammals than they are to crocodiles? So to try to solve the phylogenetic relationships between these 3 groups of organisms, I will make my vote approach with characters. The first is a character of the circulatory apparatus, which is called the aortic arch, which turn either left or right in lysamphibians, in mammals, or in crocodiles and birds. And on this slide, when a character changes through time, when it changes, for example, from left to right, the new state of the character will be underlined. So what is underlined on my slide is the evolutionary novelties. And the basic idea to reconstruct the phylogeny of organisms is to detect the evolutionary novelty. And if a given evolutionary novelty is shared by 2 organisms, either we can suppose that it occurs by chance, but more likely we can suppose that the evolutionary novelty has been inherited from their common ancestor. It means that if there is a common ancestor of 2 organisms, these 2 organisms are more closely related in the phylogeny of the organisms. So here you can see, for example, that the right orientation of the aortic arch is an evolutionary novelty shared by crocodiles and birds. So it means here we have a character which suggests us that crocodiles are more closely related to birds than they are to mammals. So now we are going to proceed exactly like in, for example, like in a democracy process in which we ask people to vote from to other people. So we are going to ask for a vote for a second character. For example, I can ask a vote for the metabolism character. As you know, in the animals, you have cold-blooded animals, which are called ectotherms, or you are warm-blooded animals like us or like birds, for example, and these are called endotherms animals. In other words, it means that the origin of the energy principally is the inner metabolism or is the external environment, for example, the sun for these amphibians or crocodiles. So for the second character, as you can see, the evolutionary novelty is a warm-blooded condition or endotherm condition, and it is shared by birds and mammals. So if you examine this character, it means that birds and mammals are more closely related the one to the other as compared to crocodiles. And this is a problem because the previous character, the yellow character, suggests us that crocodiles and birds were closely related. But we have a conflict of information here because another character, the metabolism, suggests that birds are not closely related to crocodiles, but to mammals. How can we disentangle these problems, these conflicts? We proceed exactly like any voting approach. We ask for an additional number of characters. In my example, I just took a third character. This is a character of the skull. This is a structure called the antorbital fenestra. It's a kind of space between the bones of the skull, which is present in crocodiles and birds, whereas it is absent in amphibians and in mammals. So the evolutionary novelty is the presence of this antorbital fenestra, so this original characteristic of the skulls. So here we have a signal towards grouping together crocodiles with birds. Now, if I try to summarize all this information, I have a majority of the character we suggest crocodiles with birds, whereas the minority, the blue character, suggests birds with mammals. To move from a more graphical perspective, we can draw the phylogenetic trees. So here we have three hypotheses. The first is that birds and mammals are closely related. So this is suggested by the blue characters. So the blue characters, this is my blue mark on the phylogenetic tree. It means that the novelty occurs along the history towards the common ancestor of birds and mammals. But in this case, I should assume that crocodiles and birds independently gained the yellow and the orange character. So the idea of the phylogenetic reconstruction is to count the number of character change during the evolution of the organisms. And here I have 5 changes, 5 steps or 5 changes. It means that I should assume 5 evolutionary changes in my characters to obtain this phylogenetic tree. Of course, I can have a phylogeny in which crocodiles are closely related to mammals, but here I have no character for this hypothesis. So in this case, the length of my tree will be 6 independent character changes. And actually, I will apply a famous scientific criterion, which is the parsimony criterion. I will try to choose the phylogenetic explanation, which minimizes the number of character changes. And in this case, it's the last phylogenetic tree, the bottom one here, in which crocodile and birds are closely related. Because they are connected by two characters, the yellow and the orange. And I should assume that the blue character has been gained independently once in the lineage conducted to mammals and one in the lineage conducted to birds. So in this case, I have just 4 character changes. This is the most parsimonious solution. So the phylogenetic tree best describing my initial characters is the last phylogenetic tree, the one at the bottom of my slide. So the group uniting crocodile and bird is called the group of Archosaurians. So today, the phylogenetic consensus is the fact that a crocodile is more phylogenetically related to a bird than to a mammal. And you have a number of signatures or evolutionary witnesses, which are the yellow and orange characters, but you have an independent appearance of the metabolism, the warm-blooded metabolism, which is called a convergence, and this is the blue situation. So to summarize, phylogenetic reconstruction of the tree of life will involve the tree which maximize the degree of agreement among characters. So applying the maximum parsimony criterion is the same that maximizing the degree of agreement among characters. And this is exactly the same as a vote approach in which the elected candidate is the one which maximizes the initial people that vote for him. So, because of lack of time, I'm moving quickly on the molecular characters. So, with morphological and molecular characters, the reasoning is exactly the same. So, with DNA, RNA, or protein sequences, we can reconstruct phylogenetic trees exactly on the same way as I showed you before with the blue, yellow, and orange characters. And now the phylogenetic results. Phylogenetic reconstruction of trees show us a very important thing. There is not necessarily a link between the similarity of the organisms and their phylogenetic relatedness. For example, here I have a very simple tree of mammals with the European mole, the golden mole, and the elephant. Just having a look on the morphology of these animals, it's obvious that the European and the golden moles are very similar from a morphological point of view. But the phylogenetic reconstruction of the history of the mammals is the fact that actually a golden mole is more closely related to an elephant, whereas from a morphological point of view it's completely surprising. Whereas the golden mole, as you can see on my tree, is not directly connected to the European mole. So a very important result in phylogeny is the fact that you have not necessarily a link between organisms with the same morphology, and sometimes you can have close relationships between organisms which are very different one from the other. With powerful tools to reconstruct the tree of life, we have now reliable phylogenies which are available for a variety of organism groups. For example, we have phylogeny for animals. On this phylogenetic reconstruction, you can see here, or you can see, I'm not sure you can see all the groups, but you have most the major group of animals. You have a phylogeny in which you have phylogenetic relationships among species. And as you can see, some branches are longer than the others. It means that these branches are proportional to the amount of character changes that occurred through time. On this phylogeny, you can see, for example, that two worms looking very similar in terms of shape, of colors, can branch in completely different parts of the animal phylogeny. So once again, with this slide, I show you that even if some animals or even if some organisms look similar, they are not necessarily close in terms of genealogy or phylogeny. Now we have the tools to reconstruct phylogenies. So I will finish with three quick examples about how we can use phylogeny to learn something about biological evolution. So the first example is the fact that we can use phylogenies to estimate the divergence time of the species through time. So this is called the molecular clock approach. And this works because I showed you before, when you reconstruct a phylogenetic tree, you obtain what is called the topology. The topology is the way in which species are connected the one to the others. But you gain also branch length. Branch length is the amount of evolution which occurred along its branch. On the phylogenetic inference tools we have today, which are available, allow us to measure this branch length. But branch length, we know that it's the product of the rate of evolution and the time duration of the branch. It's exactly that during the common life. To have a given amount of distance, you can move along this distance at a certain speed or at a certain rate during a certain amount of time. So for the phylogenetic branches, it's the same. If we know the branch length thanks to the phylogenetic reconstruction methods, and if we have an idea at which the rate of the evolution proceeds along the phylogeny, as you can see, we can deduce the amount of time along each branch of the tree. So this means that if you have a phylogeny, for example, here the phylogeny of the major eukaryotic groups, plants, fungi, animals, and so on, if you have an idea of the phylogeny, and if you have an idea thanks to the fossil record or thanks to the paleontological information, this is the red stars on the phylogeny. In other words, when appeared the different groups of plants, fungi, or animals, then you can extrapolate this information thanks to the molecular clocks in the rest of the tree. And you can estimate the age of divergences with confidence intervals. And this shows you, for example, that some groups appear during the tertiary, secondary, primary area, or during the Proterozoic era. So when you have a phylogeny, and when you have paleontological information that can be connected to it, you have molecular clocks tools which allow you to measure the ages of divergence of each groups of organisms. So this can be used to show or to evaluate whether some geological period were more with a higher number of species than the others. For example, if we have a look on a time-calibrated phylogeny of mammals, which is the one I show you on the slide, on the top, you can see the time-calibrated phylogeny, and at the bottom, you can see a measure of the morphological evolution. And this morphological evolution increases at the beginning of the appearance of the major mammalian groups. And thanks to the time-calibrated phylogeny, you can see that a major increase in mammalian morphological complexity occurs nearly around 80 million years ago. So here, this means that we have a tool to know when organisms diversified and when their morphological or anatomical complexity changes, which can help the biologist to understand which are the determinants of this evolution. Now, when we have the phylogenies, and these phylogenies have time calibration giving us access to the age of divergence of the different group, we can move to the next point and see how the shape of the tree can inform us about the dynamics of the divergence of organisms through time. For example, here we have different scenarios in which we simulate the diversification of organisms through time, but also their extinction. As I told you at the beginning of my talk, remember that most of the species that lived on Earth are now extinct. So this means that extinction is very important, and today, of course, we all know that extinction is very important due to the environmental changes. And what you should keep in mind is the fact that the amount of groups appearing through time and the amount of groups disappearing will have an impact on the global shape of the tree. As you can see here, for example, on the top right of my slide, you have a tree with numerous branches. So this is a situation in which you can easily conceive that many groups appear through time and are always living today. But for example, if you take another tree, the one on the top left, on the top left you have a tree with few branches. So with few branches, you can imagine that either you have had a low diversification through time, or you have high diversification, but with many extinctions, meaning that you have a tree with a few number of branches. So this slide is here in order to show you that we have the tools to deduce the amount of diversification and extinction that occurs during the course of the evolution, just observing the general shape of the phylogenetic tree. So when we have this, we can correlate the diversification of extinction rates on a phylogeny either with the groups, the corresponding groups of organisms. For example, we can see that dinosaurs became extinct at a given period of time, or that some organisms diversified at another geological time. But you can also correlate this with geographical areas on Earth. For example, you can see that with green, blue, and red groups of organisms, some diversified in the New World, in the America, whereas the others diversified in Europe or in Asia. So diversification patterns through time and through the geographical area can be deduced from the shape of the phylogenetic tree. Last point now, with the phylogeny, we can also portray the ancestors. Because we study the evolution of the characters along the phylogeny, we can start from the characters of the present day or extinct species and try to portray which character was present in their last common ancestor. And for example, it has been done for Luca, the last universal common ancestor, because people showed that some of the proteins that we have in the major group of organisms on Earth, these proteins have a composition into 7 amino acids, which correlate with the optimal growth temperature of the corresponding microorganisms. So this is true not for macroorganisms like us, but rather for archaea, bacteria, or unicellular eukaryotes. So you have 7 amino acids whose protein composition increases with the optimal growth temperature. So we can imagine that if we are able to reconstruct which was the ancestral content in the 7 amino acids at the origin of the tree of life, we can correlate this with the optimal growth temperature and deduce if Luca lived at medium, low, or high temperature. And doing this, for example, here you have a phylogeny of the major microorganisms groups on Earth. We have tools to reconstruct the ancestral amino acid composition. So we can portray the amino acid composition of Luca, given the amino acid composition of the present day organisms. And when we do this, we show that Luca was probably a mesophilic organism. I mean an organism living at temperatures like 20 or 40 degrees, but not at high temperatures. To the contrary, it means that in bacteria and in archaea, you have independent gain of the thermophily ability, in other words, the ability to live at high temperatures, for example, temperature of 90 or even 100 Celsius degree. So as you can see, knowing the phylogeny and reconstructing the ancestral character state allow us to correlate this with some macroscopic characteristics. I am now going to conclude this presentation. So you recall that my initial question was how to explain this tremendous diversity of organisms on Earth. And the answer is that you have a number of processes and patterns that are shaping the evolution of organisms on Earth, leading today to a high diversity of forms. So to recapitulate this, just remember that when time elapses during a generation, the genetic material is changing and is transmitted with its mutations from generation to the next generation. If we start with genetic material, the genome are the evolutionary witnesses of the change which occur from generation to generation. And by doing this, if you wait a million or billion of generations, new species appear with the phenomenon of speciation. Some of the species are going to be extinct. And during this diversification or extinction phases of species, you have very different species which can appear. For example, here on my slide, either cyanobacteria or either bats, which are very different organisms. But now, what is interesting is the fact that when biological evolution gives rise to very different organisms, you know that different organisms will have very different life history traits. These different life history traits are, for example, the fact that big organisms will have smaller population sizes or longer generation times. By contrast, smaller organisms will have larger population sizes or shorter generation times. And I recall you that population size is, for example, one important factor which governs the population genetics of the organisms, which means that as a feedback, the evolutionary forces at the population genetics level which act on the species will change through time because the organisms are different. So we have a kind of giant feedback loop in which genome changes. Because genome change, you have change into the species. And because species change, the evolutionary forces at the population genetics levels make genome changing again. And to recapitulate, the processes which act at the population genetics level are the one, as I spoke about, for example, mutation, selection, or genetic drift. And the patterns which occurs during the biological evolution are patterns which evolve, change into the phylogenes of genes, and ultimately patterns which affect the species tree. And now we are going to try to reconstruct the general tree of life in order to better understand which patterns and which processes govern the biological evolution. Thank you for your attention.